In the dusty, Midwestern town of Chicago's southern suburbs in the early 1950s, a young boy grew up amid the quiet hum of working-class life. John Wayne Gacy was born into a world that promised both hard labor and small-town camaraderie. In the bustling neighborhoods of suburban Illinois, children played on cracked sidewalks while adults labored at local factories and small businesses. Yet, even as the boy moved through these familiar routines, there was something elusive in his expression, a distance that belied the innocence expected of youth. John's earliest memories were painted in shades of routine and repetition. On crisp autumn mornings, he would ride his battered bike along tree-lined streets, the leaves crunching beneath his wheels. At school, his quiet demeanor drew little attention. He was just another student who sat in the back and scribbled in his notebook, his eyes sometimes clouded with thoughts far beyond his tender years. At home, his family's modest dwelling was filled with the simple rhythms of daily life, the aroma of a home-cooked meal wafting through the air, the sound of laughter and clattering dishes, and the steady pulse of neighborhood activity. As John grew older, his life seemed to settle into a pattern that was both dependable and, for those around him, entirely ordinary. In his teenage years, he began working small jobs, first at local diners and then in factories that hummed with the relentless pace of post-war industry. Neighbors saw him as a reliable young man with a charismatic smile, always ready with a kind word or a joke. Yet behind that congenial mask lay a hidden intensity, a fascination with the darker undercurrents of life that few could fathom. Evenings in the suburban homes were marked by shared meals and the gentle bustle of conversation. John, now an adult, was known to host neighborhood gatherings with a friendly, unassuming air that won him favor and trust. In his modest house, decorated with a mix of second-hand furniture and carefully arranged personal touches, he would welcome friends and acquaintances with open arms. His hospitality was genuine, his laughter hearty, and the soft music playing in the background lent an inviting warmth to every gathering. But in the quiet moments after the guests had departed, when the laughter faded and the lights dimmed, John would retreat into a solitary world. In a small study tucked away at the back of his home, he pored over worn notebooks and faded photographs. Here, in the silence of night, he allowed thoughts and impulses that no one would ever see to stir. It was during these solitary hours that the seeds of an insidious transformation began to sprout, a transformation that would eventually shatter the fragile veneer of normalcy. Throughout the late 1960s, as the world around him continued to change with the tumultuous tide of social upheaval and cultural revolution, John's life appeared outwardly unremarkable. Neighbors still recognized him on his routine evening walk through the leafy streets of his small community, his gait measured and his smile disarming. He continued to host community events, attend local functions, and maintain the friendships that had been forged through years of trust and shared neighborhood life. It was in these years that John's routine took on an almost ritualistic quality. Each morning, before the world fully stirred, he would rise in the pale pre-dawn light to a silence that felt both comforting and deeply isolating. In the solitude of those early hours, he meticulously planned his day, scrutinizing schedules, making lists, and sometimes, on rare occasions, scribbling symbols in a hidden notebook that he kept locked away. Though no one asked him about the contents of those pages, to those who glanced in his direction, there was always a fleeting note of something unspoken, a hidden depth that was never discussed. In the daytime, his work at the local construction site or factory provided him with a steady rhythm. a series of tasks and routines that allowed little room for deviation. At lunchtime, he might sit with his co-workers on a bench under a bright sky, sharing simple meals and stories of family life. In these moments, his rough hands and firm mannerism were evident, and his quiet humor shone through. Yet even amid camaraderie, he maintained a distance, a solitude that was as much a part of him as his friendly exterior. By the early 1970s, as John settled into middle age, life's routines grew both more established and more secret. In his neighborhood, he was a fixture, a man whose reliability and outward charm made him an admired, if unassuming, figure. Local business owners greeted him by name, and his house, always kept in pristine condition, stood as a silent testament to his careful attention to detail. It was around this time that John's private world began to slowly diverge from the world seen by friends and neighbors. Late at night, after the last call had been made and the television's flicker faded into silence, he would slip away to a hidden space in the basement, a room whose door, inconspicuously tucked behind a false panel, led to a small area where he kept a collection of personal artifacts. There were photographs, faded letters, and strange objects whose significance was known only to him. Here, in these secret hours, he allowed his darker thoughts to take form. There was a quiet thrill in the act of concealment, a tension between the persona he showed to the world and the secret self that lurked behind locked doors. At these moments he recalled fragments of memories from his troubled youth, incidents that had planted seeds of fear and fascination in equal measure. In this private refuge, John often replayed the images of his own isolation, lonely nights spent wandering empty streets, the cold indifference of adults when he reached out for care, and the unsettling whispers that sometimes echoed in his mind. He began to gather these recollections with a compulsive care, as if by cataloging them, he could somehow master the surges of darkness that welled up inside him. By the mid-1970s, as the social landscape shifted and new ideas were challenging old ways, John's outward life remained constant, a steady, comforting presence in the community. He continued to attend church services on Sunday mornings, always dressed neatly in a suit and tie, his demeanor warm and inviting. In these public settings, he was the picture of decency and reliability, even as his private pursuits grew increasingly disquieting. Neighbors found little to suspect. After all, his reputation had been built upon decades of consistent, pleasant interactions. On several occasions, John had entertained local youth at neighborhood parties, performing as Pogo the Clown, a persona he adopted that lent him both a cover and a means to express a side of himself that he otherwise kept hidden. In costume, with bright makeup and a painted smile, he performed magic tricks and humor that delighted children and impressed parents. It was during these moments that his charm was most potent, the dichotomy between the macabre thoughts of his inner life and the joyful jester on stage, almost impossible to reconcile. Yet the persona was simply another layer of mask in a man who understood the powerful role of appearances. Late in the 1970s, as the subtle churning of his inner world grew more restless, signs of a deeper, darker impulse began to manifest in ways barely perceptible to those around him. While he continued his daytime routines, waking early, working reliably, socializing amiably, there were moments when his eyes would cloud with an intensity that hinted at inner turmoil. A careful observer might have noted the way his smile sometimes faltered when he glanced at the wayward laughter of a child, or the soft vulnerability of a neighbor's concern. In these fleeting seconds, the public mask slipped, revealing hints of the storm beneath. During one particularly cold winter's day, after a long shift of labor at a construction site, John was seen by a co-worker, Leo, who recalled that he had paused outside the factory gates. Leo noted that John's gaze was fixed on a passing car, as if lost in a painful reverie, a moment later explained away by the cold biting at his skin. Yet Leo recalled it vividly, the impression of that silent intensity lingering like the chill in the air. In the evenings, when the world grew quiet, John's routine involved him retreating earlier than usual, disappearing into the quiet of his home long before the neighborhood retired for the night. One cold November evening, the ordinary threads of routine began to twist into a pattern that would eventually become irrevocable. John hosted a small gathering at his home, an occasion that had become a quiet hallmark of his social life. Friends, neighbors, and even a few local dignitaries gathered in his warmly lit parlor, where soft music played and conversations flowed over glasses of wine. The night unfolded with gentle camaraderie, the kind of scene that promised nothing more than a pleasant evening among trusted company. As the night progressed, however, John's behavior grew increasingly idiosyncratic. He excused himself several times, leaving the group with vague assurances that he was retrieving something from the basement. His guests observed nothing out of the ordinary in his brief departures. He would return with a polite nod and a gentle smile. Yet there was a subtle change in his demeanor, an almost imperceptible tension in the way he regarded those around him, as if he were measuring every moment. One guest, a local councilman named Albert Ross, later recalled that during one of these absences, he noticed that the corridors of John's home seemed unusually quiet. The dim light from the basement window flickered and danced across old portraits and shelves lined with carefully arranged books. In his memory, the scene held a quiet menace, as if the very walls were hiding secrets. Albert did not mention it at the time, writing it off as the effect of a long night and a few too many drinks. Yet the memory persisted, a small detail that would later haunt the retelling of events. Over the next year, as John continued his outward routines with unerring punctuality, dark currents began to ripple beneath the surface of his everyday life. Investigators later discovered that the homes and neighborhoods in which he lived were touched by inexplicable tragedies, the unexplained disappearances of young men who had, for a time, disappeared from the city's underbelly. Friends recalled that John, when asked about these cases, would speak with an unsettling calm, his tone measured as if the tragedies were part of an inevitable, if unspoken, plan. The shadow of his internal darkness grew as the years ticked by, hidden beneath layers of charm and social polish. At family gatherings, during one-on-one conversations with acquaintances, and even in the quiet moments on his front porch at dusk, John's eyes would occasionally betray an inner conflict, a flicker of something unnameable that suggested a man wrestling with forces beyond comprehension. None of those who knew him could have predicted that this hidden struggle would culminate in a series of acts so coldly calculated that they would forever stain the history of his community. Then, in the dark corridors of the mid-1980s, the unthinkable finally began to unravel. One crisp autumn day, John's routine as a community figure was shattered by whispers of missing individuals. Local authorities had begun to piece together a pattern: young men who had vanished after brief encounters with a man known for his affable nature and clownish persona at community events. These disappearances occurred quietly, without the panicked outcry one might expect, their patterns as subtle as they were sinister. Investigators started connecting the dots from discarded items left in the streets and testimonies of acquaintances. Neighbors, increasingly disturbed by the incongruities in John's polished exterior, recalled moments when his smile faltered and his eyes darkened with an intensity that belied his public geniality. At first, these anomalies were dismissed as the natural evolution of a man coming to terms with midlife burdens. Yet, as evidence grew, so did a pervasive sense of dread, a realization that beneath the facade lay the workings of a meticulous, cold, and dangerous mind. Law enforcement began to cast a wider net. Their inquiries delved into John's long history, a life marked by routine, modest aspirations, and gatherings that once celebrated the simple joys of community. Friends remembered how he had once shared his dreams as Pogo the Clown, filling parties with laughter and wonder. But the very persona that had earned him admiration now was seen in a new, sinister light. A careful review of his past revealed small, often overlooked details, a series of unsolved disappearances, cryptic photographs in abandoned albums, and late-night absences from community events that pointed to a pattern of predation. Authorities meticulously combed through evidence, records of encounters, witness testimonies, and even John's own personal journals, where cryptic entries hinted at inner turmoil and grim fantasies. The investigation proceeded with a steady, clinical determination, yet the full scope of his hidden life could only be gleaned slowly, as fragments of his double life were revealed piece by piece. As the evidence mounted and public suspicion turned to horror, John's carefully maintained routines began to crumble. His public appearances, once marked by an easy charm and steady smile, grew sporadic and erratic. Neighbors whispered of a change, a man who no longer greeted them on the street with the same warmth, whose once bright eyes seemed clouded with regret or something darker still. In private moments, John wrestled with the mounting pressure, his former confidence now replaced by fleeting expressions of despair and isolation. In interviews with those who had known him for years, several recalled being startled by how his demeanor shifted when discussing dreams of community and hope. What had once been a kind, compassionate figure now appeared agitated, his voice tight as he recounted his inner thoughts. Some saw in him a man battling demons he could neither fully articulate nor control, a battle that, in the end, led him down a path from which there was no return. The day of reckoning came quietly in the early hours of a cold winter morning when law enforcement, having gathered overwhelming evidence, finally moved in. Neighbors awoke to an eerie silence in the streets, a silence that would soon be punctuated by the grim process of arrest and revelation. In John's unassuming house, law enforcement officers combed through rooms that had long appeared normal to those who had frequented them. Behind closed doors, in drawers and locked cabinets, they uncovered disturbing evidence, photographs, personal journals, and a host of items that bore witness to the inconceivable brutality behind the mask of a community man. Witnesses later recalled a day when the facade fell away entirely, a day when the welcoming smile of a neighbor was replaced by the grim expression of a man finally unmasked. As the investigation unfolded, the true nature of John's double life was laid bare in stark detail. The steady, predictable rhythm of his early years gave way to revelations of unspeakable horror, a meticulously orchestrated series of crimes that had left scars on the community and a legacy of terror that would echo for decades. In the aftermath, as the city struggled to comprehend how a man who had once been a cherished figure could commit such atrocities, the investigation into John Wayne Gacy's crimes took on a solemn, almost surreal quality. Courtrooms and media outlets around the nation grappled with a story that defied the simplistic narratives of good and evil. Interviews with acquaintances, courtroom testimonies, and the relentless pursuit of every fragment of evidence gradually wove together the tapestry of a life lived in extremes, a life marked by public adoration and private damnation. For many, the shock was not only in the monstrous deeds themselves, but in the realization that the darkness had lain hidden in plain sight. The cheerful laughter of a clown, the friendly greeting on a neighborhood street, these were the very elements that had granted him a veneer of normalcy. And now, in hindsight, every small detail, every moment of unguarded vulnerability took on a new meaning, a silent cry that warned of the abyss behind the smile. In the years that followed, John Wayne Gacy's legacy became both a subject of grim fascination and an enduring warning about the dichotomy of human nature. The routines of his early life, the simple joys of a boy riding his bike, the steady rhythms of a man working among his neighbors, were forever overshadowed by the unthinkable darkness that had taken hold of him. The community, and indeed the nation, was forced to confront the unsettling truth that evil can often be found where one least expects it. In the echo of each recollection, a family gathering that turned tragic, a friendly smile now marred by suspicion, the ordinary had given way to the extraordinary. The meticulous record-keeping, the personal journals, and even the sparse moments of introspection that John had recorded in solitude became all the more chilling in light of the later revelations. They served as haunting testaments to the slow unraveling of a man's soul, a process that many would later describe as inevitable, though impossible to predict. In the final analysis, the tragedy of John Wayne Gacy's life, and of the countless victims who fell prey to his hidden terror, remains a stark reminder of the complexity of human nature. The quiet, methodical routines of his early years, the simple acts of kindness and public cheer, all stand in jarring contrast to the brutal acts that later emerged. In the interplay of light and shadow, hope and despair, his story continues to haunt both those who live through it and those who study it in a quest to understand how evil can hide so cunningly behind a familiar, smiling face.